Good evening, I'm Mike Knetter, and welcome to the UW Now, where we bring you experts from the Badger community talking about timely and important topics. Confidence in higher education has declined sharply among the American public over the past decade. Is this part of a broader trend of skepticism about national institutions generally? Or are higher education institutions somehow failing us? Will this loss of confidence erode America's investment in research universities and thereby jeopardize our economic and military leadership in the world? Tonight, we're going to unpack the causes and consequences of declining confidence in higher education with two experts, both former UW-Madison political science professors. That's right, it's the special faculty alumni edition of our show. Charles Franklin is professor of public policy and law at Marquette University and a leading expert on public opinion in Wisconsin. He served as director of the Marquette Law School Poll since its inception in 2012. In 2005, he co-founded pollster.com, an award-winning website for the analysis of polling data. He served for 8 years as a member of the Board of Overseers of the National Election Study, and he's been a member of the ABC News Election Night Analysis Team since 2002. Charles, I miss you. It is great to have you back, even though we're doing this virtually now. But thanks for joining us.
Always good to be here, and thanks for having me, Mike.
And kicking us off tonight is Ken Goldstein, Senior Vice President for Survey Research and Institutional Policy at the Association of American Universities. Ken's a leading expert on public opinion regarding higher education. As a professor of political science at UW, he won the Kellett Award for his career research accomplishments and the Chancellor's Award for Excellence in Teaching. Previously, he was president of Cantor Media, a nonpartisan political consulting firm based in Washington, D.C. And he has consulted on network news election night coverage in every U.S. federal election since 1988. No wonder you got a few gray hairs, Ken. I mean, anyway, welcome, gentlemen. This might have been a conversation we have had over coffee or in front of live audiences of alumni in years past. You two were great participants in those programs, and thanks for getting the band back together tonight to examine these issues anew. So Ken, you're going to lead us off with some of your survey research, and then we'll bring Charles back in and we'll have a conversation about your findings.
Great. Thanks for the kind words of introduction, Mike, and great to see both of you who are good friends. And I don't know if things have changed in Wisconsin, where people only have these conversations over coffee, because when I used to live there, we occasionally would have these conversations over a beer as well. Since I left Madison a number of years ago, I've been doing work for a group called the Association of American Universities. And we probably have a lot of people who jumped on here today, all excited that they were going to hear from the AAU, and they thought they were going to hear about whatever new basketball recruits the Badgers were going to get. But that is not the AAU that I represent. I work with the AAU. That's a consortium of the top research universities in the country, the top research universities in the world, of which UW is a major and an important member of. And I do survey research work for AAU, and then I also do work for individual universities, and have done work for the University of Wisconsin Foundation in the state as well. So I'm going to jump in and show you a few slides. And if I have any former students on here, sorry to bore you once again with my PowerPoints, although when you were probably in my class, they were overheads, which I threw on an overhead machine in old Ag Hall. Let me start by giving you a little bit of context. And Mike talked about how there is declining trust in higher education, and that point has got a fair amount of attention in the media. But I want to differentiate a little bit about what we mean when we talk about the different universities and different colleges and universities that comprise the higher education sector, and how there's some differentiation there. So these are actually survey results from 2018 from the Pew Research Center, very well-known, reputable think tank that does a lot of survey research in the country. And they came out with a survey that summer that showed that the majority of Americans thought that the higher education system is going in the wrong direction. And remember that phrasing, higher education system, which does sound a little bit awkward. And I'm going to come back to that in a second. That very same summer, Gallup, another major venerable national survey research organization, came out with results of its yearly survey, where it asks the American people every year and then releases data about how much confidence Americans have in various institutions. They do this study every year. They don't ask about higher education every year, and they've asked about it episodically, so 3 times since 2015. And a couple things I'd point out here. You see higher education there at number 4. That's the good news. And sometimes people, forget what the most popular institutions are in this country. Small business, the military, and the police have consistently been the top institutions in this country. But you see that just about every institution has decreased. Mike mentioned that both Charles and I have worked in television news for quite some time, so maybe that wasn't the greatest part of our introduction, which if you go all the way down to the bottom there, you see one of the lowest levels of trust is in television news. So you see some folks down there on the bottom, or some institutions down there on the bottom, that really didn't have much lower to go. And so the good news is higher education is 4th. The bad news is that higher education has had the single greatest decrease of any of those other institutions. But remember way back to 2 minutes ago when I talked about that Pew slide, it said the higher education system, or even higher education. And I remember when I saw these results at the time, I thought that's sort of an odd formulation. If I was at my kid's football practice, or if I was at the dog park, or if I was on an airplane and somebody asked me what I did, I wouldn't say I'm in the higher education sector business. It sounds sterile at best, perhaps a little scary at worst. So, as I said before, I work with the AAU, and no one knows who the AAU is, and our goal is not necessarily to make everyone know who the AAU is. But we wanted to see if people understood what the different missions of universities are. There's 4,500 universities in the country. There's scores of colleges and universities in the state of Wisconsin, and all of them do important work and have important missions. But a place like the University of Wisconsin is different, that in addition to teaching students and teaching massive numbers of students, it's teaching students across all levels: BA, BS, MA, PhD, professional schools, business school, law school, medical school. It is also doing that at scale, very large numbers, and it is producing huge benefits in terms of research and then other resources that it provides the state and the community. So wanted to understand if Americans understood the difference between these different sectors. So this is a finding, and Charles has done lots of survey research, and he'll know sometimes you can be smart and sometimes you can be lucky. And this was a question where my staff and I were a little bit smart, but also a little bit lucky. The lucky part was that we happened to be in the field literally the exact same days as Pew. Pew asked its higher education system question, and they show underwater by 15 percentage points. I asked America's leading research universities, and we're going to get to in a second whether Americans actually understand what those universities are, and it was plus 40. The smart part, or the sneaky part, was not only did I use Pew's exact methodology, I used the same exact field house, people who gathered the data, that Pew does. So I used the same people that Pew uses and used their exact methodology. We asked America's leading research universities, they asked the higher education system, and you see that there's differentiation. So like Mike suggested in his intro comments, that people understand that there's some differences in the missions and appreciate what universities like the University of Wisconsin does. So an obvious question is, okay, Ken, you made up America's leading research universities. Do people actually know what you are talking about? So one way we have done that, and we've done this a number of different times, is we say, hey, name 3 of America's leading research universities, and let people open-end write down 3 universities. And we're not doing this to rank or rate our universities, but we're using it to see if Americans mention those organizations that are in the AAU. So in the AAU would be just about all of the Big Ten, the Ivy League. I was about to say the Pac-12, but that doesn't really exist anymore. So USC, Stanford, out west. And so when we looked at the data, it turned out that 9 out of 10 responses were actually AAU members, these great research universities in the country. The top 29 most frequently mentioned members were AAU. And then we found more mentions of certain universities in their home areas. But what was also interesting is a lot of the mistakes we found were on the medical brand. So people would say Mayo Clinic, Cleveland Clinic, Baylor Health and Medicine, which was also giving us a hint that when Americans were hearing America's leading research universities, they were thinking both health research and healthcare delivery. Let me try and zip through these slides very quickly. We do a number of different techniques when we do survey research. And one is A/B testing. So if anyone is in politics or anyone is in marketing, you're basically saying, does this work better or does this work better? And this is a question where we do, and sometimes it's fun to play the other side. So we do a pretty strong, nasty, negative message against universities, basically saying, hey, a place like University of Wisconsin, you're not going to get to go there. Your kid's not going to get to go there. You're not going to benefit from what goes on at that university. Versus a positive message that says, even if you don't get to go to the university, you benefit from the research that is done at that university. And that America's leading research universities are a valuable national asset. The places like the University of Wisconsin are a valuable national asset, and that they are obviously a valuable asset to the state. Now, that's all good news, but we also have challenges. And sometimes those challenges are reality, and sometimes those challenges are perception. And there can be lots of complaints about universities, but the main one we find that really concerns people is the rising cost of a college education. And I think Mike, putting on his old economist hat on, is going to share with us some data at the end about what the reality of that is. And some of it is people don't understand reality. Some of it is even what we would consider, or many people would consider, fairly modest tuition is a big challenge for many people, especially in a bit of a middle class donut hole. Work we've done in the state of Wisconsin, and sometimes, Mike, Charles, and I are all old professors, and sometimes we just make things too complicated, and sometimes universities make things too complicated. People want their kids to get jobs, and they want them to be educated, and they want them to have good careers, and they want that done in an affordable way. And there's certainly lots of amazing things we can say about our universities, and lots of amazing things we can say about the University of Wisconsin. But sometimes, and I know we got some ex-journalists on here as well, sometimes we step on our own lead. Speaking also about some of those misperceptions, these are national data, and I'm going to pop back and forth between some national data and some state data here. My claim is not that Americans or Wisconsinites are tax lawyers that understand exactly what for-profit and not-for-profit is. But our universities are not-for-profit. University of Wisconsin is a public institution that's not-for-profit, but only about 1 in 4 people nationally think that most leading research universities are not-for-profit. And when you look at the state of Wisconsin, and I'm not showing the previous question here, but we asked a question, hey, is University of Wisconsin public or private? And everyone goes, oh, that's a stupid question. University of Wisconsin is obviously public. And then the very next question, people say that it is for profit, and fewer than 1 in 3 say it's not for profit. Now, I'm not someone who, when someone gives the wrong answer, is like, oh my God, wow, people are, ignorant about that. You can understand why people might think these big institutions, these big universities, are for profit, especially when you're seeing, if you're watching Badger games on television, or you're seeing Camp Randall filled on a Saturday night. Some of those things might not look to people like they are not for profit in endeavors. It's also flying in the face, and I showed some slides at the beginning about how there's been a decline in trust in all institutions in this country. That is a pretty serious headwind that our universities are facing. And so I don't want to minimize the challenge. Sometimes there's misperceptions. Sometimes we need to do better. And my job is helping university leaders both talk about themselves better and also do better. But this is my new favorite question. I'm going to show you a result nationally, and then I'm also going to show you a result in the state of Wisconsin. And you see the question wording here, and I'll just paraphrase it. And it's basically saying, listen, you can be annoyed with universities for a whole variety of reasons. And you don't have to love every single part of a university. But at the end of the day, don't you think the country is better off because of America's leading research universities? And the answer is unambiguously yes, that they do. And you see, there's lots of polarization in this country, and Democrats and Republicans agree on very little. But you see, while there's slightly more support from Democrats, you also have strong majority support from Republicans appreciating that the country is better off because of America's leading research universities. And then this is the result of the question for UW-Madison asked in a state of Wisconsin poll that I did for the Wisconsin Foundation. And this is one of the best, if not the best number I've ever seen, the best result I've seen in all the polling I've done around the country for various universities in various states. Not saying that every person in Wisconsin, every citizen of Wisconsin loves every single thing that the university is doing. And even people who will say fairly negative things about the university in a variety of other ways, a huge majority, 76%, say they are that the state is better off because of the University of Wisconsin. A couple more questions here. As I said before, cost, accessibility is a challenge for us, and I think Mike's going to share some data with you. And there's some glass half full and some glass half empty here. So we asked about the value of a college degree. And you see this question asked in various ways. And typically people will say, is it valuable or not valuable? I've added a third punch, a third answer category where people can say it's valuable and worth the cost, valuable but not worth the cost, or not valuable at all. So, the good news is very, very small minorities of people do not think that a college degree or a degree from the University of Wisconsin-Madison is valuable. Also, good news that people in the state think that a degree from the University of Wisconsin-Madison is more likely to be valuable than a generic college degree. But when I'm talking with university leaders, we have a challenge of making that light green number more blue, having people understand that there's great value to a college education, and the data is pretty unambiguous about that, but also understanding the challenges and costs for many families nationwide and in Wisconsin, even with the things that universities try to do to make that more affordable. Let me just quickly share two last slides here, not from data that I gathered, but Chronicle of Higher Education is probably not something that many of you read unless you're aspiring university administrators, but it's inside, I don't want to say inside the Beltway, but inside higher education population. And they did a study, a survey of the American public. And you see that what people think that very important for colleges, universities to focus on is careers, developing a skilled workforce, research and science, and they also rate us pretty highly in those areas. But I, for one, would like to see this develop a skilled workforce. People think it's important, and I'll leave us with the thought of I'd like us to be able to convince Americans that we are doing a good job at training the workers of the future, not only for the careers that are going to exist in a year or two, but the careers that we don't even know about that are going to exist in 20 or 30 years. So for my former students who are afraid this was going to be a 2-hour power lecture, that is it. I think we're going to have time for questions, and look forward to the conversation here with my friends Mike and Charles.
Thank you, Ken. That was a great tour of public opinion, both nationally and in the state of Wisconsin. Let's bring Charles in, Charles Franklin, and Ken also. And Charles, why don't you, your thoughts about Ken's findings, things you agree with, things you might have questions about. Give us your reflections.
Sure. First of all, it's a great tour de force looking over the wide range of opinions people have about universities and research universities in particular. And I don't have any real criticisms of any of that. I'd go back to one of the first slides he showed, and that's the decline in confidence in institutions generally. Every institution he showed has seen a decline. I believe might be one exception, and that was very small. I noticed, and Ken actually pointed it out, that universities or higher education was the third highest ranked in 2015, is the fourth highest ranked today. So relative to other institutions, higher education remains near the top. On the other hand, higher education had the biggest drop over the period from 2015 to 2023. So it's hardly something we want to crow about, but it is worth it recognizing that being in the top 4 out of the 12 or 15 institutions that he showed is still, relatively speaking, a pretty decent deal. One of the things it reminded me of, and I think you see it in some of the other questions, is that when we ask people to generalize about institutions that are distant from them, we kind of invite stereotypic views. Now, those may represent how people generally feel about them. But one of the things that we've seen in our Wisconsin polling is that when we ask about public schools and confidence or satisfaction with public schools, that's not nearly as high as when we ask about satisfaction with the public schools in your community. Likewise, the other direction, when we ask about crime, people are very concerned about crime. But when we ask about crime in your community, they're much less concerned. And I think some of that holds over to most, if not all, of these institutions, that for most people, most of the time, we're not having direct contact with these institutions, certainly not on a day-to-day basis. And when it comes to universities, maybe we had 4 years of college, in which case we had direct contact. And since then, we've gotten charming letters from the Alumni Association. But except with very charming letters. And of course, we've come back to campus for athletic events or other kinds of things. So I don't mean to say that we've lost contact, but there's a vast difference between being a student for 4 years and being an adult 20 years or 30 years post-college and having any kind of direct perception of what's happening on campus, unless perhaps your child is now at one of those institutions. So I want to stress the episodic connection most people have with higher education. In some parts of their life, it's a very intense connection. In others, it's pretty intense when your child is in school. But most of the time, you're pretty far back from it. And what that means is that when we ask anybody questions about higher education, they are largely thinking about it in terms either of their own past or in terms of what they hear other people saying about it. And this is where opinion leadership, especially from political figures, but opinion leadership from others in the community, including universities themselves, I think plays a big role, and where this generalized negativity to institutions that we saw in the rest of Ken's data really stands out, that we are in a pretty nagging world right now where people really don't trust the institutions anywhere close to the levels that trust was 10 years ago, let alone 20 or 30 years ago. Exactly why that is a big question. I'm not going to answer that tonight. But I do think that is an issue. But it's especially an issue because if people don't have direct contact with the institution, then where do they get these perceptions? What is the basis for them to form those perceptions? I wanted to also pick up on one of the slides Ken did about whether it was worth it to go to the university or whether it wasn't worth the cost. And he had that both generally and I think for UW-Madison. We asked a similar question in our November national survey last year, a year ago now. And what we found was that there was a similar kind of general negativity about whether the cost of college was a worthwhile investment in the future, or whether it was risky because you weren't sure that it would really pay off in the end. Looking at those data, what I found was that having gone to college boosted that notion by about 10%, that it was worth it. Not a huge difference, and these were differences of about 40 to 45%, 40 to 45% worth it, about 55% not worth it. So for those who did go to college, that came up to about a 50-50 split, about evenly. But that 10-point gap between those who had gone to college and those who hadn't persisted across the age spectrum from young to middle to old. It persisted over gender. It persisted on whether you currently have a school-age child, in which case you might be thinking about higher education in that future sense for your kid. And it persisted across partisanship and political ideology. Those who had gone to college in each category were almost all right about 10 points more likely to say that investing in higher education was worthwhile compared to those who had not. Now, of course, these are people who chose to go to college. So presumably those who were sure it wasn't worth it didn't choose to go to college. I'm not saying that going to college made you think it was better, but I do think it shows that there is a persistent difference, and it's only about 10%, but it is 10%. But by contrast, we didn't see very big differences by age, except for the very oldest people who were the most supportive of going to college. We didn't see much by gender. We didn't see a whole lot by whether you have a school-age child or not. But on partisanship, we saw a 20 percentage point difference between Republicans and Democrats, with Democrats being 20% more likely to say it was worth it to go to college than Republicans. And when we separated out non-college Republicans and Democrats, it was still a 20-point difference. When we separated out college-educated Republicans and Democrats, it went up 10 points, but it went up 10 points for both groups and remained about a 20-point difference. There's a similar gap on political ideology. So the punchline of this is that people's demographic backgrounds only made modest differences in the perception of college and its value. having the experience of college did make a positive 10-point difference, but these partisan and ideological divisions are substantial. And of course, those are part of the current political dialogue in the country and are part of the sources of those opinion leaders who are speaking about the issues of higher education, and that has a role to play in how people form their perceptions as well. Last takeaway is just to sort of point to the positive things in Ken's data, whether that's workforce development or medical centers or research breakthroughs. The universities do very well on those. And the University of Wisconsin-Madison does especially well when it's singled out as whether the state is better off for having that institution rather than not. And so in the end, I think we have to appreciate those positive aspects of it, but still recognize that the political side of this is an important aspect of how people are forming their opinions and how those generalized views of institutions vary from one party to the other.
Great observations, Charles. Piling on a bit about proximity and how that matters to people's opinion. I spent a period of time working at the Council of Economic Advisors when healthcare reform was a big priority of the Clinton administration. And we did a survey of people about their healthcare and about their perception of healthcare system in America. 90% of people surveyed were happy with their own healthcare, and 90% of people thought the American healthcare system was broken. Stunning, right? How could that be? But it speaks to that proximity. And the other thing you said that I think is really interesting is people with proximity and more experience and who touch the university. In our work at the foundation, when I encounter someone who's really unhappy about the university, the best thing I can do to fix that is to bring them to campus and have them meet people and talk to people that run the university and find out, do they think like you? I mean, do you think they're crazy? And more times than not, people leave there and go, oh, wow, this is a great place. But, sitting from afar, reading the media drumbeat of stories, it has an impact on how people feel. You mentioned we're still the fourth highest ranked institution of all those that Ken reported sentiment on. But we did have the biggest drop. And that drop occurred over 7 or 8 years. Was that perception or reality? I'm going to ask you, Charles, first, and then Ken. What fraction of that do you think is just the partisanship that's, escalated in America? And how much of it could be higher ed institutions have really dropped the ball? I mean, I've always thought of our sector as not changing much. So I don't really know what happened in the last 8-9 years, but give me your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think the greater degree of politicization of higher education is certainly part of it. And whether that's 8 years ago or 10 years ago doesn't matter very much. But over recent years, universities have become a target of political complaint. Having spoken up for universities a minute ago and pointing to that higher ranking, I'd say we also have to very frankly admit the things that give people a negative impression of universities. Whether those are demonstrations on campus or questions about speech or about who is respected on campus or not respected on campus, all of those are very real issues. And unfortunately, they don't have simple answers either. But I do think that we have to keep those things in mind. Last thing I would just point out is that outcomes are not equal for all students who go to a higher education institution. That can vary tremendously on the UW-Madison campus, with some people having fantastically positive experiences, but others slipping by the wayside. But that's true across the range of UW system campuses, private institutions in the state, and so on. So there is no one single higher education institution that people can benchmark against. Instead, there are these individual campuses and individual students with different outcomes that vary quite a bit, and where there's always something negative that can be picked out, even if there's quite a lot of very positive things as well. It's a huge challenge to convey that complexity to people. And I applaud bringing critics to campus and letting them sit through a class and see what that class looks like. Let them go to a lab and see professors working with undergraduate students and training them to be the next generation of scientists. All of that is very good, but it's going to take us a while to run every person who resides in Wisconsin through our classrooms. So we have a challenge there of getting that message out.
So I'll make bad television and agree with everything that Charles said there. But sort of take up his last point. Mike's a very energetic person, but as Charles said, can't bring everybody on campus. And I was out on campus a couple weeks ago, and it's good for the soul to be on campus. It's not great to be in Washington, D.C. watching coverage of campus. And so that is a serious point. But Mike, you also asked sort of I'll paraphrase, like the whose fault is it question. And I think universities have to take some responsibility for that. And even in the premise to your question, you asked about, what was it 8 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago? Well, we don't know because universities weren't doing research. And so, I don't want to make this sound like AAU made the greatest decision in the world by hiring me to do survey research, but they should have hired someone to do survey research. And can you think of any other large organizations, institutions, companies, corporations in this country, which would just sit around and go, well, we think the public thinks this. And part of being able to tell your story is knowing what concerns people have, what things people appreciate about you, and how best to talk about yourself. And he's a friend of Oliver's and all of ours, and I used to work for you, Mike, Vince Sweeney. I remember Vince once said, imagine if people were giving you hundreds of millions of dollars every year. Might we say thank you? And I was always so proud to be able to teach University of Wisconsin undergraduates, and I would have gladly said thank you to the people of Wisconsin for letting me blabber at some of you who might have been here in Ag Hall about American politics and have you work in my labs. And I think we as universities can do a lot better job in not literally bringing everybody to campus, but trying to bring people to campus and understand what we're about. Now, for the communicators who are right, they hate it when people go, oh, we just need to tell our story better. It's hard. It's noisy out there. And as we've talked about, there's not great trust out there. But on us a little bit, universities, I think, sort of just took for granted that everyone would think how important we are. And I think we need also to tell that story better. So I thought I should say that so just people wouldn't think I was a complete shill here on the evening.
Well, that's a fair comment. I would say the structure of higher education is such that the top universities don't really feel they face existential threats. I mean, we're oversubscribed by miles. We got 65,000 applicants every freshman class. So, how hard are you going to work on public opinion under that circumstance? It's a little bit different than the private sector, but I agree with you. Universities collectively made a good decision hiring you to work at AAU to understand that landscape better. I think that is an important point to make.
I'll just interrupt for a second. I mean, your anecdote there, when I first started doing this, there were some presidents who were like, why are we doing this? I have more customers than I know what to do with. And I was saying, like, this is not about you getting more applications. There's great support that the taxpayers of this country give our institutions, that that I believe our institutions deserve, but we also have to talk to those people as well.
That's a great point. You know, you made a point about America's leading research universities are viewed differently than the higher ed system. You also showed that sentiment about the University of Wisconsin-Madison is better than sentiment about the higher ed system. If you look in another state, Ohio, does Ohio State do as well relative to the national data? Does Indiana do as well relative to the national data? I mean, is UW-Madison doing okay as a flagship with our stakeholders?
Trying to get me in trouble, Mike.
Sorry.
Okay. I'll give you the line, which like I would not comment on your research generally with that. So I can't do specific states, but what I can say is that 78-6 number is among the 2 or 3 highest I have seen of any university in the country. It is a terrific result. And again, like other results aren't as terrific, and there's nuanced views about the university, but even people who have challenges with the university will say the state's better off because of UW-Madison. And that relationship is the strongest I've seen.
Thank you. Can we talk a bit about some UW-Madison data that we've pulled together?
Sure.
I think Jake can pull up some slides on that. So, you know, some of the issues people care about with higher education, access, you know, can my kid go here, or is this just serving elites? Affordability, efficiency, you know, what are the faculty doing? I mean, are we really teaching enough students? Are we delivering on our research mission? And economic impact. So here's a little bit of a tour through some data over the past 10 years, for the most part, of what's going on at UW-Madison. And that is the period roughly in which this decline in sentiment has occurred nationally. So on access, the reality is we're taking a lot more undergraduate students, as shown on the next slide, than we were 10 years ago. We were about 28,000 undergraduates. Now we're pushing up close to 35,000 undergraduates. So that's a pretty significant growth rate over that period of time. Most of that growth, as shown on the next slide, is non-resident students that pay full freight tuition. We still take as many admitted freshmen from Wisconsin every year as almost the highest level we ever had, 3,700 freshmen per year from in-state, and then some transfer students also after the first year is done. But the growth that we've seen in enrollment has largely been out of state. And the reason for that is the in-state high school graduate population is flat. So taking the same number of in-state kids, it's actually a higher percentage of the graduating class. And then furthermore, we've had an in-state tuition freeze. Part of the reason for growth was to try to solve the economic problem of, you know, relatively flat state funding, and that's fine. The state has funded the university well for 175 years. I'm not complaining about that tonight. I'm just saying, you know, we needed to grow our revenue over the last 10 years, and one way to do that is grow the class, mainly out of state, where you have higher out of state tuition. So that's what's really occurred, and that pie chart shows you that the current undergrad population is about 50% Wisconsin, as many kids from Wisconsin as we ever had, and then 10% Minnesota, 40% non-resident, and that's where all the growth has been. Next slide will show you a little bit about why we've been able to grow out of state. Our application volume is through the roof. We used to get about 30,000 applicants a year a decade ago, and now it's up to about 60,000 applicants. We admit far more students than we used to admit, and our yield rate is actually down because these out-of-state students tend to apply to lots of schools, and so your yield rate on out-of-state tends to be a bit lower than in-state. So the blue bars, applicants, the red bars, acceptances, and the green bars are the students who actually matriculate, and you can see we are matriculating more students than we used to. It used to be around 5,500 in the freshman class, and now we're up over 8,000 in some years. The lines on the chart are just our probability of admitting a student, which has hovered around 50% throughout most of the period. And then the probability of an admitted student accepting, that has gone down as these out-of-state applicants have gone up and more of them are admitted. Next slide. Is a degree worth it? And are students really pursuing important employable areas? Top 5 majors 5 years ago: econ, biology, computer science, psychology, finance. Top 5 majors today, same thing. So whatever people think is going on in universities, computer science majors, not only has it gone from number 3 to number 1, it's grown by almost 350 students a year. That's almost enough to be a top 5 major in itself. And economics is still a very large major. Psychology is big. Finance is still big. Biology is still big. Very important fields. Shows you the breadth of the educational endeavors at UW. Next. So affordability. In-state undergrad tuition at UW-Madison is $3,000 a year less than in-state undergraduate tuition at the other Big Ten publics on average. So a great price, at least, for our resident undergrads. Non-resident undergrad tuition were $3,000 above the mean of other Big Ten publics. And that is a reflection of our ranking within the Big Ten publics is near the top. So we price out-of-state students near the top. But in-state, you're getting a screaming deal. Next. You can see that deal gets even better and has improved for low-income families. So the average annual cost of attendance has risen over the last decade by about $4,000, and that includes tuition, fees, and living expenses. But you can see if you're a family earning less than $30,000, what you actually pay on average 10 years ago was $7,300. Today, it's more like $3,700. So it's actually gone down considerably. And so on as you go through the income distribution until you get with families over $110,000 a year in the state of Wisconsin, they're pretty close to the annual cost of attendance. So they get less financial aid from the federal government, state government, et cetera. So you can see that at UW-Madison, we are particularly doing a good job of taking care of low-income students, both through federal programs, state programs, and our own scholarship support, privately funded. Next slide. Student debt is one of the things that higher ed gets beat up for a lot. 10 years ago, about half the students coming out of UW-Madison had some debt, and the average level of debt for those that had debt was $25,000. Probably not a crisis. You're going to buy a car for that price, and you got an education. Today, it's only 37% of the graduates leaving with some debt, and the average is still about the same, $26,000 a year, $27,000, I guess, rounding up. But effectively, fewer students, a smaller share of the students have debt, and the level of debt really hasn't moved up. So Madison is doing really well on affordability. What about efficiency? Moving on, you might wonder, as we've grown enrollment, have we hired a bunch of faculty? Well, actually not. The undergraduate students per faculty FTE has risen a fair bit over this period from 14 to 14 and a half to now more like 16 and a half students per faculty member. So average class sizes for faculty are up a bit. Some of that, I'll say, is offset by hiring of instructional staff who help leverage faculty time, but nonetheless, faculty are more productive, I would say, in the undergraduate education mission. What about research? You'll see research awards per faculty FTE. A decade ago, a little bit over $400,000 per faculty member. Today, it's more like $600,000 per faculty member. So faculty are still delivering more on the research mission than they were a decade ago. and they also have more undergraduates per faculty member. So that's a pretty good story about productivity at UW-Madison, and that's something that sometimes you hear people complain about. Next. So, when you roll it up and you ask, like, what does the state get for its investment in UW-Madison? And to be clear, UW-Madison's been around 175 years. For most of its history, it was funded largely by taxpayers. It's only in the last 40 years that tuition became a bigger share of revenue, philanthropy, federal dollars, et cetera. But what's the value that the state gets from UW-Madison? Well, that in-state, out-of-state tuition difference is about $30,000 a year. And if you think of the out-of-state price as the market rate, in-state students, 17,000 of them, are getting a discount of $30,000 a year off of the out-of-state rate. That's $510 million of value right back to state residents, if you want to think of it that way. And I think that's the only reasonable way to think about what is the value of that. And the reason we had to grow out-of-state enrollment, frankly, is to generate more of that revenue to help support the low in-state price that we're offering Wisconsin residents. Looking a bit further on the impact UW creates, think about the export services revenue that the university generates. We're a services business. We do research, we do education. The revenue we get from non-resident undergraduate tuition at full price per student would be $600 million a year from Minnesota residents and people outside of Wisconsin and Minnesota. The spending by those in-state, these out-of-state undergraduates, if you assume it's $20,000 a year, that's going to yield another $350 million a year of spending in the state of Wisconsin because of the attraction of UW-Madison. Revenue generated from federal awards for research, instruction, student support, and outreach, $900 million a year of money flowing into Wisconsin, spent here because of the attraction of UW-Madison. Funds transferred from the UW Foundation and WARF, partners and affiliates of UW-Madison, that's about $400 million a year. And most of that money really originated from out-of-state sources, not entirely, but a good share of it. And then finally, research funds from businesses and other nonprofits is about $200 million a year. So just looking at the export revenue, the money flowing into Wisconsin from non-state sources because of the quality of UW-Madison is over $2 billion a year. That's a big number on a base of about $550 million of state support. So I think UW-Madison has a pretty good story. That's not to say that there aren't issues. And part of the reason we're as good as we are is the history of state investment. So I just wanted to make some of those points about the reality on the ground at UW-Madison. So Ken, Charles, thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think the economic impact of the university is clear, but it's nice to see it backed up by the numbers this way. And I go back to Ken's question on the survey. Imagine we waved a wand and UW-Madison just vanished. Does anybody believe that wouldn't have a tremendous negative impact on the state through these revenue issues, through the training and job creation and workforce development issues, and for just the broad value of an educated population that we provide? So I think those issues, if you push them, the answers are really very obvious that we carry our weight, or university does generally carry its weight. What I think the worries are about whether we're doing a good job preparing students for their future jobs. And we do have some data on that. It's not like we don't know anything about that. Most graduates are employed shortly after graduation and so on. But I think it's a legitimate question to ask whether we're doing it efficiently. I think partly you've answered that. And the value to the kids when they graduate. The last point I'd make goes back to the top 5 majors. Those are not unserious majors. We can talk a lot about whether a major is defined as valuable only if it produces technically trained people who can step into a specific job, like they went to trade school. But the data prove that we have tremendous assets that are preparing students in very marketable fields with very high levels of demand in the workforce. So again, not to say there aren't problems and challenges and issues out there, but I think the value that your economic numbers show is also reflected in the value of what students are majoring in and what their job prospects after graduation actually are.
Yeah, and you answered Michael Benninger's question about, are universities really preparing graduates to be successful in the job market? I think the answer is a resounding yes. And none of the majors that we saw were engineering, but we do graduate, almost 1,000 engineers a year. They're just divided up into different subspecialties, so they don't show up as one of the popular majors. So there's a lot of, very obviously marketable skills. And as you both have pointed out, a lot of the other majors, whether it's political science, where you guys used to teach, students, they learn how to write, think, analyze, and that's super important in today's world in many, many different jobs. And students coming out of that department get great jobs too.
And your future does depend on you as a student. What are your ambitions? How much are you focused on where you're going? Those are things that the university can only marginally influence through good advising and good instruction. But ultimately, it lies with students to select those career paths. And it also includes, you mentioned political science, which has been a pretty substantial major, where a lot of graduates go on to law school or go on to public policy school. So there's also these carry-on benefits that lead to further education at the master's level or beyond, which do lead directly to careers and in fact, pretty high-paying careers as well. But that's not to say that every student that graduates, no matter what their major is, guaranteed to get a high-paying career launched immediately. That is much more a matter of the individual.
Ken, your thoughts?
Yeah, it's I agree with that, and I'm going to give what's been my consistent answer here. We as universities need to talk about that more, and I think I believe in competition. Departments need to talk about that more as well. And Mike, we first met when you came to University of Wisconsin as business school dean, and I don't have the numbers in front of me, but what's the increase in undergraduate business majors at the University of Wisconsin? What's the increase in undergraduate business majors at AAU institutions or all institutions? It's because there's been a pretty big focus on, you were doing a sales job trying to get majors, telling students, if you take our major, we're going to prepare you. And I think other majors shouldn't shy away from making that argument as well. And so I would make that point. The other thing about perception versus reality, a place like University of Wisconsin-Madison benefits a lot by being in the same club as a Harvard or a Stanford. But I don't know, Mike, what's Stanford sticker tuition now, right? They're going to announce a $80,000 tuition. Now, the truth is, how many people actually pay that, and they discount it. But if you Google Stanford tuition or Harvard tuition, you're going to get a huge number. And so when we ask people, what do you think tuition is? What do you think you would pay? They vastly inflate that number. So, again, at the risk of being a shill here, you're right. I mean, you're not only getting a $36,000 out-of-state tuition, you're arguably getting an $80,000, private elite education at that $10,000 price.
Agreed.
Mike, I just want to put one thing in. As I recall, and I don't have the exact numbers, UW-Madison has one of the highest numbers of corporate CEOs in the country who have graduated from Madison and gone on to extraordinarily successful corporate careers. And I believe that the majority of those students graduated in the liberal arts, not in a narrow technical field. So I do want to put out there that liberal arts education does not mean you don't have career opportunities or the ability to excel in your field. And while I praise computer science majors and especially economics, because my daughter's an economics major, I think that it bears saying a little bit for the value of just a broad liberal arts education and how that has been the launch pad to so many very successful UW-Madison graduates over the years.
Yeah, the CEO data is really, it's about a third, engineering, business, L&S for undergrad majors. Well, we are at the top of the hour, and that's all the time I had asked for from you. Thanks for bearing with me. I've obviously got some kind of cold here, but really great to see the two of you again, and great to have this conversation. I'm sure our audience really enjoyed it, and it's great to have you back. So thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having me.
Great. And we'll be back on December 12th, where we'll do our annual predictions show. We'll see who we can rustle up for that, but we'll talk about geopolitics, the economy, and who knows what else, sports for the year ahead. But we'll make predictions across the board, maybe elections. So I hope you can join us then. And in the meantime, thanks for watching, and on Wisconsin.
In 1848, just 2 months after the creation of our beloved state, a great university was born, the University of Wisconsin, to serve, educate, and benefit people from every corner of Wisconsin and beyond. And for 175 years, we have pushed forward, energizing dreams and igniting innovation. With educational opportunities that create promise and research that improves lives, UW-Madison is a place where an idea can change the world. And as we look forward, we also look back to stand up for what's right, build common bonds, and a better future. When combined with inspired goofiness and Badger spirit, there's an inspirational and unconventional vibe that's all Madison. It's more than just fun and games, though. At the UW, we go from brainstorms to breakthroughs, from today's students to tomorrow's leaders. This is where an idea can change the world, the whole world, a corner of the world, my world, our world. UW-Madison's profound eurekas and personal ahas transform us all and serve the greater good. As proud Badgers, we celebrate the last 175 years and the next as the UW charges forward. On Wisconsin.